a good policy is one that is efficient or is cost effective.
In today's podcast, I had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Elizabeth Popp Berman about her new book, Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equality in U.S. Public Policy, recently published by Princeton University Press. This book is likely of interest to anyone interested in economics, public policy, or just the intellectual foundations of 20th century American social policy. Dr. Berman is an associate professor of organizational studies at the University of Michigan and a sociologist by training, and this is her second book. My name is Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape, the podcast. This is really fun to meet you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Popp Berman. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's really good to talk to you today.
Well, so before we get started, can you? We're talking about sort of the topics of your new book. Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equality in U.S. Public Policy, just came out from Princeton University Press. Before we start getting into the meat of the book, I was wanting just to kind of learn a little bit more about you and your background, where you grew up and what your childhood was like.
Yeah, so I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in kind of the middle of nowhere country, very small local place. And, I grew up, my parents were teachers. I grew up on a farm.
Oh.
And it was the kind of place where people didn't really leave a whole lot. So I always kind of, felt a little bit constrained there. And I ended up going to college at Penn in Philadelphia. And that was sort of my entree into the big city, and then into academia from there, I guess. But but my parents are still there, and that's where we go. See them for the holidays and stuff.
It was a small town in Pennsylvania? Is that
very small town, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I bet that was, what kind of stuff did you like doing as a little kid?
We did 4-H. We had sheep, I played with my brother because there wasn't anybody else around. So that's kind of
Yeah. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and it was like wonderful until you hit like high school, and then you're like, oh, there really is nothing to do here.
Yeah. No, it's a little bit idyllic in a way, but then you kind of start to outgrow it. You're like, ooh.
Yeah. And so your academic career, so you at Penn, tell me about Penn. What did you end up studying at Penn? What were you interested in?
So I studied sociology from the outset. So I was a sociologist as an undergrad too, although I wasn't particularly focused as an undergrad. I just kind of did the major like you do. And then after that, I went and I worked for a small foundation for a little bit, and decided that I was interested in going back and getting a PhD. And so so that's kind of when I started to focus my interest in a little bit, and then I went to Berkeley for a PhD.
Yeah. What was it? What were you interested in? What kind of stuff were you interested in as a student in college? And how was that different from when you ended up at Berkeley?
Yeah, honestly, I think in college my interests were really scattered. I guess I have always, there's pieces that are kind of through lines. I've always had interest in some ways in thinking about, broadly how markets are organized and sort of like the cultural spaces around those, right? So I don't know. I remember writing a paper as an undergrad, a big paper on conditions that facilitated technological innovation throughout history. But I've also always had kind of these interests in higher ed and sort of sociology of science and these sort of spaces around knowledge production too. So that's kind of some of the areas.
So why'd you end up in sociology if you were so interested in markets and not ended up in economics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the pieces that have always interested me are more sort of the squishy cultural factors around the edges, so how do we think about what kinds of what are our broad frameworks for thinking about when do we want to govern parts of life along market principles, and when do we want to think about doing it along other lines?
Right.
And there was when I started, when I started graduate school, I got very interested in like, agent-based models for a while, and sort of thought, oh, well, maybe it's sort of like Thomas Schelling kind of models, and thought, oh, maybe this is sort of a more formal space that interests me. But I kind of ended up taking more of a historical turn, and then just sort of kept following that direction.
Right. So in sociology, how do I think about your kind of methodological background? It's like, because so it's probably more in the qualitative branch, but you're not an ethnographer. So, but how would I think about it?
Yeah. I mean, I think, comparative historical methods, historical thinking about case studies, sort of leveraging comparisons across qualitative cases, that's the kind of the broad space that it's in. But I'm not an ethnographer either.
Right. So what'd you study at Berkeley? I mean, like, what'd you specialize in?
Yeah, like just in terms of, so what were my exam areas? So one was, work and organizations was one broad area. Or work and organizations, those are two separate areas. And my dissertation, which eventually became my first book, was on how academic science became more entrepreneurial. So sort of trying to understand why in the 1970s and 80s, kind of the same time period that I'm looking at in this book, within universities, people really started to think of academic science as something that could be leveraged for economic purposes, and to sort of encourage scientists to start to be more entrepreneurial and to start companies, do more industry collaboration. And that kind of like was sort of in the broad space of things that I was interested in. And there was a lot of controversy at Berkeley at the time around these kind of university industry partnerships that were going on. And that kind of led me down that direction, and that became a whole bigger project.
Wow. So you've been really you've been knee deep in this, like, this interconnection of the life of the mind and and markets and economics. Like, your whole career's kind of had that feature.
Yeah, and I think even more than that, that first project, a lot of the, like, I didn't go into it particularly focused on the policy side of it, but I really thought that the actual account of what happened ended up having a really strong policy focus. And so sort of a big piece of the explanation ended up being, well, policymakers, in the late 70s started to really seize onto this idea that, innovation is what drives economic growth.
Right.
And they made a bunch of policy decisions that were shaped by that. And so that really changed the environment that scientists were operating in. And so, so I think in some ways, that's kind of a seed of where this book came from, is, seeing, oh, look at that. You can actually see places where, new theories about how the world works are really changing the kinds of decisions that policymakers are making. Yeah.
So the kinds of questions that you've been interested in, it's like, I think about just this idea popped in my head. When you teach the principles, it's called Principles of Microeconomics, like your intro econ, there's like a first lecture, and a lot of the first lecture is the stuff of your book, to be honest, so it's kind of interesting to reflect on it, how so much of the thesis of the book, these core ways of thinking, are kind of communicated day one. But one of them is the positive normative distinction. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Yep. So I just was, as I was thinking, and I wonder, I don't actually know where I'm going with this, but it's so deeply rooted in an economic way of thinking to say, well, there's the positive theory, which is like, this is how the world is described. And there's the normative theory, which is like, this is how we should do things. But deep inside it, there is this point of contention, because so much of the positive pieces are kind of normative, like things like rational, like the way, that you should take an action if the benefits outweigh the costs. It's it's a subtle nudging that you do to the student. And it's sometimes when you talk about it, you'll catch yourself doing it, because you'll say, this is how the way people are. But then you'll kind of also say, but then they're not always like that, and they need to be like that. And I just wondered, this economic way of thinking about the positive normative, how has that been, how is it, what do you, as not being an economist, when you see an economist sort of reason that way, what are the salient things that you notice that like an economist is oblivious to, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, like on the one hand, like it totally makes sense as a distinction, right? That if you're thinking about, oh, well, the positive questions are, is X going to affect Y, or what's the optimal decision under certain parameters,
Right.
and so so totally get where that's coming from. But I think in the context of the book, one of the things I'm trying to say is that those kinds of positive questions still have norms embedded within them, right? They're not really outside of norms. And like in policy context, a lot of this ends up happening because they imply a particular way of thinking about what is it that is a good policy. And so, and I think from like a micro perspective, a good policy is one that is efficient or is cost effective, or is, encouraging, markets to function in a competitive way.
Right.
And, those are all certainly things that you might want to pursue and that are valuable in themselves, but they are also normative choices. Those themselves are preferences, and sometimes they're in competition with other things that you might want.
Right. And so you when you sort of interact with economics as a field, it sort of seems kind of obvious. These kinds of things seem kind of obvious in a way that is an economist can't see. I guess I'm trying to figure out like what is it that keeps the field of economics from not being, in your opinion, aware of that or talking about that or caring about it, about that there's this deep level of value within the system that's just not within the field that's just not taken seriously or not recognized?
I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's just bracketed, right? And like there's certainly lots of economists who have talked about this over time. I mean, Kenneth Boulding in the 60s had like a presidential lecture that kind of gets at these questions. Alice Rivlin wrote a bunch of stuff that sort of really addresses these questions head on. Yeah. So it's not like people don't recognize it or that it's not understood, but I think it's also easy to bracket, right? You just kind of, it doesn't really get you further in terms of doing what the main intellectual project is. And so, you kind of set it aside and say, okay, well, it's just not really that relevant for what we're talking about. And obviously, like you said, there's this other kind of normative positive distinction where, there's things that are very explicitly, I don't know what kinds of distributional outcomes do we want or something, right, where you can really more explicitly separate the normative from the positive. But, so it's not that I don't think that economists don't recognize it. It's just not a center of attention. But I think that also can translate into, particularly when you're talking about more applied contexts, assuming that it's just neutral, right? It's not normative. It is just sort of a toolkit for making decisions and doesn't carry any kind of inherent value system within it.
Yeah. So there's things in your book that I was really surprised by. This distinction between, I guess first, before we just dive into it for the sake of the reader, could you kind of tell me what the thesis of the book is for someone that hasn't read it yet?
Yeah, I mean, so the book is basically trying to do two things. So one is, it is just sort of tracking how, what I'm calling, the economic style of reasoning, which is not so much necessarily what PhD economists are doing, but sort of this like broad Econ 101 kind of very, basic way of thinking about policy problems. So understanding how that was introduced into policy, like the people who were carrying it there, how it spread around, how it actually got kind of institutionalized in different places. And that's focusing on the story between, mostly it happened between the 1960s and the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing that it's doing is really trying to show that this had political effects. Mm-hmm. And in particular that by centering these sort of subtle normative things that are embedded within thinking about problems in economic ways, that those often came into conflict with other kinds of ways of thinking about policy.
Right.
And that was sometimes politically constraining, particularly for Democrats, where you sort of find a conflict in a lot of cases between, economists who are kind of working under Democratic administrations, kind of working within this center-left space, but are coming into conflict with people further left in the party who are kind of approaching problems in different ways and sometimes getting squeezed out.
Yeah, I think like this is I was thinking as I was reading it that I bet you maybe one of the more surprising things a reader might encounter is this idea that center left is a driving force in your thesis, as opposed to hearing about the Koch brothers or the University of Chicago or Austrian economics. It's kind of like you're laying this social change hypothesis squarely on the backs of the very groups of people that you're not really taught to. They're kind of like not the sympathetic group to that right-wing part. And so what exactly is why? First of all, I wanted to know, before we get into that, what exactly is this economic way of thinking? How is it different from a paradigm? How is it like, what exactly, because it sounds like you're referencing two things, the specific economic way of thinking, but then actually even more deeper than that, there's a general, almost psychological phenomenon called a way of thinking, or something that meant, I could tell it meant something. And I was wondering what that meant first.
Yeah, I mean, so the way that I'm trying to use it in this book is to basically just talk about these sort of very simple concepts that you would use for kind of orienting yourselves to problems. And so, you look at a policy problem and you think about it in terms of, incentives, in terms of trade-offs, in terms of, efficiency or cost effectiveness. If you're looking at something that's around market governance, you're thinking about externalities, you're thinking about how do you create a rule so that this market can work competitively. Right. Just those kinds of simple ways of approaching problems that you would learn pretty early, and that importantly aren't just taught in economics programs, but also that you get exposed to if you were going to a public policy school, for example, or if you depending on what part of law that you might be exposed to in law school. Yeah. And so that can be, it's obvious it's got some relationship to what people are doing in economics departments when they're doing research and stuff, but it's a little bit simpler than that. Yeah. And it can often, kind of depart from that, right? It's not necessarily tracking very closely onto whatever's going on in the cutting edge of the discipline. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so is this economic way of thinking just a collection of facts or something, or is it like why does it matter? What exactly? I mean, because it sounds like it's not policy recommendations and it's not research even. It's more like it's something else. I mean, why is it important in your thesis? Yeah, I think a lot of it is because it gives you sort of an approach to thinking about what makes for good policy in a lot of different policy domains. And I think this is, one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book and to convey is that, it's kind of in a lot of ways, it's so naturalized that even if you're, not an economist, this is kind of a familiar way of thinking about policy problems and what makes for good policy. Right. But you really see that this is a way of approaching policy problems that kind of has a very specific historical origin and really comes to prominence at a particular moment in time. And so, so really in the 1960s, you see these ideas introduced, they're kind of, some of it's coming from the Rand Corporation, and then it's coming into government via people who are introducing this new budgeting system. And they're really developing, the idea that, okay, how do we think about what a good policy is? A good policy is one that cost effectively allows us to achieve our goals. And that means, thinking about policy in a way where you have these relatively identifiable goals that you can measure. You can think systematically and quantitatively about, how do we compare different potential paths to achieve that? And that's really the toolkit for thinking about, what a good policy solution is. So there's this big piece of it, that's about cost effectiveness.
There's that level of self-reflective kind of discussion happening in the 60s of like the good society is one that minimizes cost.
Yeah, and so so really where this is coming from and where it's coming out of is it's coming out of the Rand Corporation in the 1950s. And so, I don't know how much people know about Rand in general. I mean, obviously, I don't know, at least I think of it today as like they do education and healthcare policy and stuff. But right at the time, it was very much a defense organization. It was funded by the Air Force. And so they're really focused on, solving defense problems that were, important in this Cold War context. And what happened was that while Rand kind of started out being dominated by physical scientists and engineers, a lot of the kinds of questions they were interested in were sort of optimization problems. And so they really wanted to know, how do we, so the Air Force's problems were things like, what's the optimal way for us to locate all our bases so that we are protected in the event that the Soviets have a first nuclear strike? And so they developed these ways of providing answers to these questions. They work pretty well in this defense context. But the folks who were there, we were like, well, these are approaches to thinking about policy decisions that we can really use in a lot of different places. This is something that we can apply to something like education policy or something like health policy. And so it kind of started in that space. And then it came to Washington in defense. And then in 1965, President Johnson said, okay, let's take this toolkit that we've been using at the Defense Department and let's apply it, let's roll it out at all the federal agencies. So let's apply this to, to the war on poverty. Let's apply this to,
can you give me an example?
Health policy and so on.
Like if he's doing it with the war on poverty, like what kinds of unique features are there that wouldn't be there had, hypothetically wouldn't have been there had Rand not done this? Like what are we talking about?
Yeah, so the specific like tool through which this was brought in, it was called the Planning, Programming, Budgeting System, PPBS. And basically what it was saying is that the way the government should budget is by identifying, again, kind of what are the quantifiable goals of a particular agency, kind of systematically thinking about what are the different programs that might get us to those goals. And then systematically comparing which, based on the information we have, which do we think is going to be the most cost-effective way of achieving those goals. And so, so obviously, you can kind of apply this to any policy area, but in anti-poverty policy, for example, it was introduced kind of in the context of a big conflict over what the war on poverty was actually going to look like. So in the early days of the war on poverty, it was organized around this idea of kind of maximum feasible participation. And so it was sort of based in this theory that, the way you solve poverty is to give poor people more political voice, and then they will be able to participate in government, and they'll be able to sort of articulate demands and so on. Okay. So that was a very different way of thinking about poverty.
Right.
And it, and it was, rolled out initially kind of before this PPBS system had been implemented. And it created a lot of conflict, right? So it introduced, all of a sudden you've got people in, poor people in cities are getting money to kind of organize and make demands on the mayors, who are often Democratic mayors. It's creating political problems for the Johnson administration. It's kind of fracturing along racial lines because, you're often talking about Black communities and white mayors, and
I have literally never heard any of this before.
Yeah. So you read the book. But yeah, I mean, so that was a very different way of thinking about like what it is that you're trying to do when you want to solve poverty.
Yeah.
And, and the folks who were implementing this PPBS system, they were like, well, okay, the solution to poverty is a negative income tax, right? Like, it's just, it makes sense, that the problem is people don't have enough money. Sort of a cost-effective way of solving that is that if you, if your income's below a certain point,
right,
we give you money.
Right.
And, and within that policy space, there was a lot of conflict between these different groups of people because they just had different ways of thinking about what is the problem that we've got here, and like what's our starting point for thinking about solutions.
Is it as organized, this like kind of other way of thinking? Is this like this other way of thinking that's like, giving voice to poor people and having to be participants in the democratic process and stuff? Like, is there a organized, like, set of writers or things that I should be thinking of, or is this just kind of like just a natural, common sense approach that just gets crowded out?
So I think it is like, I think on the one hand, like there are certain themes that there's certain like competing themes that pop up in different times and places. I think on the other hand, some of it is pretty specific, right? Like the people who are making these arguments were very much in the context of this very specific political moment. Yeah. And it's, they had their own coherent ideas, but it's not like it's a single framework that's a competing framework that's been passed along.
Right.
But I do think like the places where you really see competition between this broadly economic approach to problems and these competing ways of thinking about it are often it's around claims that are made on the basis of rights. Right. So, you have a right to healthcare. You have, there was a push for welfare rights for a while in the 60s and 70s. You have a right to a clean environment, where the concept of rights kind of pushes you towards thinking in terms of absolutes and everybody should have access to it no matter what. And it kind of pushes you away from thinking of things in terms of costs and benefits and, how do we think about doing this most efficiently? And so, so it's not so much like one set of thinkers necessarily, or like a competing discipline, but there are these particular types of political claims that often kind of come into conflict.
They are in conflict. They're sociologically always in conflict because they were competing voices in a particular policy debate.
Yeah, and I think I think the debates that you have around universal health insurance, for example, and some of these, like the ways that they played out around 1970 or so, and obviously they've kind of evolved over time. But at that time, the standard democratic position was we are going to create universal health insurance. Everybody is going to have access to it. Yeah. It's not going to involve cost sharing. It's going to be healthcare as a right.
Right.
And you had a lot of liberal economists who were making the competing argument that is very expensive and it's not a very cost-effective way of doing things. Right. And if we can think about, well, when does cost sharing make sense? Like how much difference is it actually going to make? When does who should we, should we actually provide this to everybody, or should people who can afford to pay for it themselves be paying for it themselves? Yeah. And so that's sort of a different way of thinking about the same problem. That, even when you had people who were still pretty supportive of, the idea that government should be helping to expand access to health insurance, tended to point them in a different direction and kind of a conflicting direction sometimes.
Right. So the political actors that were kind of key in this, you mentioned, presidential administrations, you mentioned Rand. Is there like key, can you tell me a little bit more about these key kind of what you see as like, at least if not pivotal, kind of just like a sequence of maybe pivotal, that kind of added up to be pretty important for a change in the, dominant kind of like what would get institutionalized?
I mean, I think the big, in terms of like how I sort of like follow these strands of thought into policy. So a big piece of it is organized around two particular intellectual communities. And so one is these folks at Rand who were, pretty tightly networked with academic economics, but we're based in Rand and we're kind of more policy oriented. And so they're a pretty coherent group who introduces a lot of these ideas. And then the other set of folks is a little bit of a looser network, but it's industrial organization economists. And so there's sort of a Harvard branch there and a Chicago branch. And they're kind of, they're entering policymaking, around the same time. It's during the 1960s, but it's a little bit more diffuse. It's more that you see, oh, here's a bunch of people who are coming in at the same time. So whereas the Rand people is you really had a specific group of people who all came to the Defense Department and then kind of spread out from there. The industrial organization story is more, people start to become more tied to think tanks, and Johnson appoints various people to positions in different agencies.
Who are you thinking of? Like which kind? Can you tell me some people you're thinking of?
Yeah, so I think an early person was, Merton Peck was on Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors and facilitates some of this conversation. You've got, this is more on the, I guess he kind of bridges the two in a way, but Charles Schultz, who was, he was Johnson's director of Johnson's Budget Bureau, and then also chair of Carter's Council of Economic Advisors. He was at Brookings in between, so somebody who was really bridging the space of kind of broad cost effectiveness, thinking about policy, but also thinking about regulation, like how should we govern markets. So those are the kinds of people that I'm talking about. So they're often people who are either primarily based in the policy world or who sort of move back and forth a little bit. Right. Between policy and academia.
Right. So it's like, you've got the welfare state, poverty, cost efficiency. And then you've got whoever, like the negative income tax, I guess that's going to be Friedman and things like that. Is that what I actually don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, Friedman was making the case, but Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors was pretty pro negative income tax as well. So it was a pretty bipartisan. And
then you've got IO, you've got the antitrust, you've got the emphasis being placed on competition.
Yeah. Okay. And also sort of people who were thinking about deregulation early on. So, particularly in fields like transportation, right? But starting to think about, so people like John Meyer, who was writing about transportation, how should transportation markets be regulated, right, as early as the late 50s. But, he and his students were starting to move into policy positions, a decade later.
Can you give me an example of like a kind of IO moment where something really significant was kind of implemented that's had long lasting ramifications, and maybe even speculate like what it replaced and what might be different? I know that's purely speculative.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, on the IO side, I mean, there's a particular moment in terms of building those connections between academia and policy. And that is that Brookings creates a program on government regulation in the late 1960s. And so, really that's kind of happening in more of almost an academic space where they're funding workshops and they're publishing volumes and they're kind of building connections among academics who are broadly working on these questions. But that becomes a source of, it really helps to consolidate a set of arguments around, again, first transportation, but deregulation and transportation and some other areas, that then kind of go on to have a lot of indirect, influence along various channels later in the decade. Yeah. But I think the other place you see a very big concrete impact, and this is one where you do sort of shade more into the Chicago space, right, and not just the kind of the centrist, is in antitrust policy,
Right.
where you have economists kind of become really much more influential in antitrust policy over the course of the 1970s, and are able to really redefine antitrust to be focusing more exclusively on thinking about its goal as being, how do we promote markets that are working efficiently.
Yeah. As I was kind of reading, I had this thought in my head, and it was kind of like a economic way of it was like an economic way of thinking, basically. But I wanted to run it by you. I was thinking, well, maybe the reason that this economic way of reasoning dominated is this: people choose their. So I was thinking, people choose their beliefs when the benefits of those beliefs, even at the deepest level, kind of, they choose these beliefs when the benefits outweigh the costs. And so, what if the reason why the economic way of thinking dominates is because there really isn't the alternatives were fundamentally weak in some way. I mean, not weak in the sense of like a philosophical, like the argument's not good, but there's something about it that's weak. Because in the history of humanity, it's kind of like we're sort of in this, we're pretty deep in this like non-religious world of a fairly mature, we think anyway, relatively mature democratic society, with over large land mass, with deeply heterogeneous people competing with one another over these over resources and power. So it's like, what if the reason this one comes up is because there just isn't anything?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I think the piece of that where I would agree with you is I think there's things about this particular approach to thinking about problems that are really useful, right? And really good at solving problems, including in political context. And so I think, right, there's one way to read this whole story that kind of says that, okay, well, you see what you've got in the 60s and the early 70s is you've got this big expansion of government, and it kind of creates this demand for thinking about how to control and manage it. And so, you fairly reasonably have a set of tools emerge that are useful for thinking about how do we rationalize it, how do we make it work effectively, and that and that because you do have this expansion of government, also kind of creates new pools of resources for supporting people who are doing that, and that is why you think about why it ends up spreading. I think where I would differ a little bit is that I think that what it overlooks sometimes is that some of the things, many of the big things that have been accomplished politically have kind of happened outside of these frameworks. And so, so if your starting point for thinking about how should we, I keep coming back to the healthcare example in my head. If you're somebody who is interested in seeing government play some role in expanding health insurance, well, you could say, okay, well, the reasonable way to do this is to think about how to do it cost effectively. But if you look at historically, like how political things have actually been accomplished, it's often been outside of that framework, and it's often been for very non-rational reasons. It's been kind of as a result of social movements have demanded something. It's been because of political alliances that have very little rational component to them at all. And so, so I think that is the competing factor that's really moving things forward. And so, yes, I mean, so
So what are the blind spots of all? What are the blind spots of what we're talking about, like the economic way of thinking, or economists, or this kind of thing? What exactly is the most important things that are not being caught or not recognized?
So I think to my mind, right, like I'm coming at some of this who's explicitly a progressive, right? So I'm not like, pretending to be totally neutral about this. To my mind, some of it is in how ambitious you are in thinking about the starting points of policy spaces. And so, so I think, for example, and sort of thinking very explicitly, not only about what kind of policy makes sense, but what kinds of policies actually resonate with people, kind of can gain broad public support, can help you sort of create alliances or coalitions that will support them, and so on. And so, I think climate is a really good example of this, where, I would be totally thrilled if we could institute some kind of cap and trade program, and that was actually something that was able to be put into place. But I think politically, several decades have shown that that's not really something that's been getting us somewhere. And so then I think you need to think about, okay, maybe our starting point shouldn't be what is a rationally sensible kind of solution to too much CO2 production. I think the starting point has to be a political one of, maybe we need to be thinking about things that might not be your first choice solution from an economic perspective, but that have the potential to build a coalition that can get something done, or that can really to give you a better path to actually achieving the outcome that you want.
Yeah, right. What, well, so along those lines, I was just, what do you think are, I guess, what do you see as the most important for addressing any of these, in your opinion? Like, I guess, is this correct? The issue is not really the way of thinking. The issue is the implications that this is having for policy and people.
Yeah, I think
that's right. Yeah. Right. So it's like, it's not. So in light of that, what do you see as the emerging problems that are kind of like, we're on some, that you see as like we're on a path to a real collision? Climate would be an obvious one, but are there other things that you sort of see that this actually is creating a real policy challenge for people?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, right, like you said, so climate policy is one example. I think antitrust policy is another one where you do see really interesting stuff happening. And I kind of go back and forth a little bit about like what my actual position is on all this, but clearly we've got some stuff going on, that there's new kinds of corporate power that are developing, and that we might want to think about addressing, that are hard to address purely through the lens of thinking about antitrust in terms of consumer welfare. And and that is something that is really locked into antitrust policy as a policy area, that kind of is what antitrust is about. Yeah. It is, people who sort of challenge that, who are coming from outside of that space, encounter a lot of barriers. And and there's reasonable arguments for why consumer welfare makes sense as the lens to approach it through. But it's one of those spaces where I think it really makes sense to be considering, okay, well, what else is going on in this in this space of corporate conduct that we might want to think about, that we can't really understand purely through that lens. And so that's another example where I think it becomes harder to address problems that are going on because you have sort of defined the problem in a very specific way that excludes other ways of framing the same
What's
problem.
what are the, maybe it's, this isn't the right word, but like, what are the damages that you have in mind that are not the consumer damages or associated with this antitrust? Like, what am I not thinking of?
Well, so I mean, I think there's two ways of thinking about it. I mean, I think one is that there's issues that arose that economists are starting to deal with, and I think this is stuff like labor market monopsony, right?
Yeah.
Where there's like a lot of research going on, and not something that was really on the radar 10 years ago. People were saying, okay, well, this is something that, and then I think that's hard enough to introduce because it's still kind of outside of the way that people have thought about policy, but it's still very much in that economic space. And then I think you have the different set of issues, which maybe antitrust isn't the best way to deal with these, but things like what are the implications of Elon Musk being able to buy Twitter, right? What does that actually mean if you've got sort of a big platform that's a public space and it kind of plays this democratic role, and certainly has some kind of implications for the public sphere. Might have other kinds of political implications. But there's really no way to talk about that kind of problem within the same sort of framework.
Right.
So maybe there's kind of two different directions you could think about it.
Yeah. Well, like, it's funny. It's making me think, like, what is the other way of thinking that it's crowding out? And it's like, I don't know how to articulate what you just said. Like, what am I supposed to be worried about with Musk being, is it the disproportionate influence of one person? But it's like, that doesn't fit into, there's nothing to quantify, No,
and I think you're right. I mean, I think there's not one alternative way of conceptualizing problems that you can say that fits a lot of different spaces equally well. And I think in specific cases, you could say, well, what are the specific things that you might be concerned about, right? So is it that we want to, ensure that, that there's certain ground rules for like how speech is set up within platforms that have, that have access to it, that serve a certain number of people, or that serve a certain size of, that control a certain amount of the public sphere.
Right.
In other contexts, it might be about political influence in one way or another. So I think that's partly why, I think that's part of the power of economics, right? Is it does have this really useful framework that you can apply to a lot of different contexts. Yeah. And that is very coherent and flexible at the same time. And so I think, I don't see one coherent alternative emerging. I think it's going to be more ad hoc and sort of look different in different sorts of spaces.
Yeah. Well, before we end, this is really, this is all kind of new for me to read in this way. I got into economics because I read Gary Becker's Nobel Prize speech on the economic way of thinking, titled "The Economic Way of Thinking," and got so much of my career has been focused on things that you could apply that way of thinking to that you didn't ordinarily. Like sex. Sex was a big part of it. Abortion policy and sex work and marriage markets and as well as drugs. It's kind of like, it was really, so it's kind of like as I was reading the book, reading the book and talking to you, I just was kind of like thinking how difficult it is for me to pry it back, because I don't know exactly where it's so now kind of deep in the soil, that I don't know how to, because your book is sort of asking, it has this mirror piece to it, but it's so focused on history and it's so focused on social policy and social change but I keep seeing myself in it. And I realize, like, I don't know how to let go of some of this, even if I wanted to. It's just real deep into once you're in it, for me, it's really hard to not think this way.
Yeah. And I think, right, like, on the one hand, this is just like how academic training works, right? Like by the time you've done a PhD, you're sort of honed in on a particular way of seeing the world, and that just is kind of locked in. But but I also I totally get the appeal, right? Like the Becker models, and like why it's really intellectually compelling to think, okay, well, like how can we extend this to different places, and how can this provide insights into different sorts of behavioral domains where we hadn't conceptualized problems that way before.
I mean, the same things could be said about Becker's crime model that's in your book. His 1968 article on crime and punishment is all, and it's an efficiency paper. It's actually, people think it's like a behavioral paper about deterrence, but it's really about how can we reduce crime at lowest cost. And the idea is that crime has cost to the victims and the police resources, and there's all this stuff in it that became extremely influential, like the idea that the criminal is rational, and so if you have, and they respond to fines, and so if it's a very low probability event that you're going to catch them, you've got to make the penalty extremely high. So he's got this famous footnote where he says, in Vietnam, what they did, I mean, he wasn't advocating for this, he was using it as an illustration, but it was like in Vietnam, speculators in the rice market would have their hands cut off. You never could catch these guys, but if you caught them, they would, do it. And it's like, again, it's like this thing with the way of reasoning. You're left going, is this what we're supposed to be doing, or is this the way it is? And like, what exactly is the distinction? This is that positive normative piece that you're left going. And it's like, I could imagine the same kind of book being written here, thinking like an economist, and going through Becker, and then sort of saying, at the exact same time as there's the war on crime, the United States engages in its really extremely disruptive experiment with putting people in prison, and lengthening sentences on lots of things. And it's like, I just wondered as I was reading it, I was like, I wonder if some of what Elizabeth's talking about actually was kind of going on, like it's so many parts of society, like at the exact same time, of this influence of the economic way of thinking of like crime policy, just like lengthen the sentences, deter the crimes. And
I I haven't dug into crime policy specifically, so I don't want to say more than I can actually speak to, but I do strongly suspect that there is a parallel story that you could tell within the space of crime policy at the at the federal level, at the state level. And I guess and again, and sort of like you're saying, well, okay, so what's the alternative, right? Like if this is a useful way of thinking about what the incentives are for people, what the deterrents are, how should we think about what the consequences should be in order to deter crime. I think what it kind of misses is then, well, what are those second order effects that maybe go beyond that? So, you could be thinking about what, is a particular kind of punishment going to be enough to deter individuals from carrying out a crime? But then what's like the broader effects on the social fabric of, okay, we've got, whatever percent of the population in prison, and and what are the broader consequences of that if we decide that that's sort of like the optimal way of punishing people.
I wonder if the success of the economic way of thinking is the feeling that this is something we can all agree on. We can all agree on scarcity. Something the way the Economist frames it, it's like that he kind of compels you and says, scarcity is the fundamental problem of all of human societies, and we must solve it.
Right.
And then that kind of leads to, and so there's a lot, that's contained even in that statement that could be disputed. But but it's like, as I'm thinking to myself, well, how would you challenge the economic way of thinking when it has so much widespread acceptance? It seems like it would require a moral vision that like we all agreed on. And that's kind of the fundamental problem, is like, we don't agree on any one story
right
about who we are and who we are and what good means and what bad means. It's like
Right.
nothing is agreed on. I mean, you definitely see that in the last week, it's like the deep disagreements. And I just wonder, like, how it's like, I just wonder if, like, economics steps in and just pretends that this is the thing that it can, it's like, this is overstating it, but economics kind of steps in and says, well, we're just kind of going to skirt that.
Yeah,
we're going to skirt that. I mean, you can even see this in Becker's writings with Stigler, the Gustavus non est disputatum. Becker says this explicitly in his Nobel Prize speech, that the economic way of thinking says preferences don't change. And throughout his writings, he says, and we're not going to be the ones to talk about preferences. Right. That's what the psychologist does, or that's what, but then the thing is, like, all of the conclusions are based on the preferences. I mean, the whole idea of a deadweight loss is based on a demand curve and where you are, where resources are relative to some allocative inefficiency is based on whether or not a person's willing, it's all gets into the apparatus that comes out of, preferences and utility and all this stuff. And so I just wonder, like, what can you do in a heterogeneous society when nobody can agree on who we are and what does it mean to be a good society, or like whatever?
I mean, I think you're totally right that, like, that's a big piece of what, why economics works, right? Like in policy kind of spaces, is it gives you this language for talking across other kinds of value differences. And, that you see this like in different sort of historical moments where, people who are not kind of working within a broadly economic framework, people who are on the left or right might not be able to talk to each other at all, but people who are, but economists who are working within the policy spaces, the people on the left and the people on the right, they might not agree on policy recommendations, but they still have kind of a common language for debating things out, right? They know what the terms of debate are.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think, there's ways in which that is really important just for being able to get things done. But I do think, that, like, I don't love that our society is so polarized, but I also think that it's okay that we have, value differences. And sometimes those fundamental differences are just the things that are going to get fought out in political spaces. And we don't necessarily have to all have the same fundamental values and orientations. And so, really, I think being, like, what I would hope is one takeaway from this is just kind of getting people to think about, when are these sort of neutral tools for thinking about policy truly neutral, and when are they actually kind of value choices of their own? And if they are value choices of their own, why that value and not some other value? And I think that's the case regardless of what your political starting point is, right? Is really to push people to think about, what are the things we value, and then, what are the tools that we can think about for getting there?
Yeah. Well, it is really, this has been really, I'm going to be thinking about our conversation in your book for a long time. This book, Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equality in U.S. Public Policy, by Elizabeth Popp Berman, Associate Professor of Organizational Studies at University of Michigan. Just came out, Princeton University Press. Highly recommend it for anyone interested in economics, public policy, intellectual history, and the United States. Thanks so much for me talking to me, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really, I appreciate your willingness to engage, and it was a really fun conversation.
Yeah. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.